Alrighty, folks. It is October 7th, and this is the OpenJS Security Collab Space weekly meeting. Um, I'll post I'll post again meeting notes so that they're here in the recording. And also, let me find the issue for the agenda today.
We may have issues. Again, Toby just opened one that we'd like to spend some time on.
Yeah, I was just adding it to the agenda in the meeting when we started the recording. Give me
Awesome.
one
Thanks.
second. Here, Toby, since you're here, do you want to start out with that?
If I unmute, it's gonna be easier for me to start. Just like, yeah, absolutely. Uh, okay. Yeah, so I opened up this issue. So some background, I have as a client the Eclipse Foundation, and as part of that contract, I'm running what's called the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, which is a group that is notably helping with the implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe, by working actively with the European Commission and with the various European standardization organizations, including Sensenelec and ETSI. So the way the Cyber Resilience Act works is part of the implementation is going to be made easier through a set of standards that are going to be published by Sensenelec and ETSI that create a presumption of conformity when you implement them. And the way this usually works when there is legislation is there is an existing body of standards that is already with these official standard organizations that policymakers kind of like just tap into, but with software and in particular open source, there really isn't that much. And so there's a lot that really needs to be invented and put together from essentially existing best practices, right? So the exercise is really, sort of like formalizing existing best practices around secure software development and vulnerability management, so that lawmakers can essentially point to, and this is how you have to do it, right? The idea behind this working group is also to make sure that those best practices are seen as best practices not only in Europe but also similarly in the U.S. and in other upcoming countries that will also decide to implement cybersecurity requirements, so that we don't end up in a really undesirable place where you know, you have conflicting practices or not the same practices depending on who's using software in which country, which would really take open source back, frankly, decades, right? A lot of the benefits of open source are licensing terms that work across jurisdictions, et cetera. So that's kind of the high level background. One of the aspects that is really important is that the JavaScript community is fairly unique in the way that software open source software is developed there, in sort of like the size of project, how they're organized, et cetera. It's, I'm not going to say it's entirely different than other open source communities, but it's fairly specific. It's also a very sizable part of the software that's used today. And so it's really important that how we do things here gets correctly understood and represented in those standards. And the European Commission has asked specifically if OpenJS wanted to be involved and wished for OpenJS to be involved. So there's really an opportunity to have a voice and make sure that the work that has been done by this Collab space in particular really is part of the input that is going to, that would be considered by those standard organizations. And so, the idea is to, answer any questions that you might have around this, and then see if, as a result, the foundation would be interested in joining the working group, which doesn't require, it's free for open source foundations, so it doesn't require a payment of a fee, and then have representatives or how to get involved and to help move all of the work that has been done, surface it rather than move it. Sorry, in the right places. They could obviously help with that latter process. That's kind of what that issue is.
What does participation in this practically look like, you think, Toby?
So we have multiple different work streams going on. And overall, I would say that the key challenge is that getting anything, I mean, that there's a lot of different things to understand to be effective at contributing, but you have to understand the policy aspects, you have to understand the standardization process, which is fairly formal and like I'm still getting an understanding of. And then you have to be savvy in the security aspects, right? So like the bar is fairly complex if you want to have a like high involvement. On the other hand, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for foundations to be able to provide input. So like a very simple first step that could be taken would be to essentially look at and I have a document that's prepared for this that I could share, right? Look at the all of the existing standards that have been requested that are going to be essentially written by Cincinnati and Etsy, and look at what kind of material we have that is relevant to any of those, and then share those in an inventory that we're currently building, right? So, there's some fairly basic and simple steps to take. And then, if folks want to be involved more, they can join some, there's, for example, there's a bunch of webinars that we ran that are recorded that you can like learn from. There is the ability to join other work streams on different topics, like we're building an FAQ to really understand what the role of an open source steward. So the CRA introduces a terminology to describe code hosting foundations. And give them compliance requirements, but also opportunities to help support the ecosystem through attestations. So this is something that could be of interest further down the road, for example. So there's lots of like it's this like sort of like very big domain, but it's also possible to really have an impact on very small things, right? So right now I think like the key things would be join the group, and provide input to this inventory process. And then maybe start family raising. That's a French word. Start figuring out like the high level picture of how the CRA works. So I would think there's like three things. So education, inventory, and joining.
I feel like we've done a lot of the work, and some of the work that we still have to do is taking that work and simplifying it you know, we're going to have a security page on our website, but I think the process is consolidating or summarizing some of the work we've done would probably be super helpful for the policymaker decision-making process. I mean, like
So
what's the level of technical expertise?
that is a very good question, and we're still trying to figure out the details of this. Frankly, like one of the challenges that we're facing is that the European standard organizations do not publish the standards that they create openly. So there is a number of court cases on this issue, and it's a completely different conversation that I don't want to get us into. But as a result, it's actually not really easy right now to know what the expectations of content are, right? So it's a process that I'm involved in. But you know, as a first step, just knowing where the sources are and what part of the standardization process they meet would be like a really important step, right? So there's I don't think there's even like an editorial step to have right now. Just like here's the things that we work on, and they describe, you know, like here's how we manage vulnerabilities. Here's you know, how we manage X, Y, and Z, right? And I think that already it would be super super helpful, right? So this is really the process we're going into right now, is going to the different foundations and saying, okay, you know, what is it that you're doing, and where is that documented, and what does it look like? And then as a second step, I think we'll start trying to figure out what the delta between those different ones is, and maybe put some you know, put something together, put a document together for each of those different standards. So like the second step is still really to be decided. First step is really like, what processes do we have in place? Where are they documented?
Robin, I think this seems really cool. And after the work we did already with the compliance guidelines, on a personal level, I would really enjoy participating in this. It sounds like I haven't never worked with formal standards committee type development before, but it is a thing that I've always been curious about because of specifically the vulnerability disclosure ISO standards that I've seen and hearing much about how that came together. So that would be really interesting. I think, Robin, I look to you for the head nod and any kind of boundaries or thoughts on what approach you would want to take with this.
Yeah. And Toby, give a little more background on standardization versus, you know, a standard setting organization. I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier on what it's more procurement policy standards as opposed to a global formalized standard. I mean, it's
So we're still, I mean, the process that is going to happen for the standards effort is unique and new, because the European Commission has made special requirements from the standard setting organizations so that they would consider the open source community's input directly. So this is fairly special. Then there was a second part to this, which is the Eclipse Foundation is building formal liaisons with those standard setting organizations. Already has one with Sensenelec and is building other ones, which will provide the ability to give input in a formal way in the process before the documents are actually public. I don't really know at this point what the input is actually going to look like and the level of formalism of those inputs. And I think part of the exercise for me is going to be trying to figure this out in the upcoming month. But I also think that it's fairly flexible, and you know, as as is usually the case with uh, really a lot of things, how much involvement you put in and how much upfront work you do kind of drives how much impact and you end up having, right? So to me, it feels like what exactly, it's hard to say at this point what exactly things will look like, right? I'm not expecting that OpenJS or even the Eclipse Foundation Working Group would be heavily involved in the standards writing itself, also because those standards are for the CRA at large, right? And the CRA is essentially the legislation is about any object, any product that has software in it, with the exception of like health devices and cars, essentially, or in airplanes, which ends up on the European market, right? So it's anything from a web app to a fridge with a screen in it, to an IoT device, so it's incredibly broad, right? And those standards are going to be describing all of that. And so, the part that is going to be, and here's the open source security process for an open source foundation in it, is probably not going to be a huge document, might point to other document, might give fairly high level requirements. And I think the exercise is going to be more around, let's make sure that the requirements don't entirely conflict with things that we know we won't be able to provide. Right? Like an example, if everyone needs to, be working on a foundation-owned computer. I'm just making stuff up, right? Like this wouldn't work for us, right? So, like, if that's not a compliance requirement, it's going to make everyone's life a lot easier. Including the legislators who don't want to end up with non-implementable stuff down the line, right? So it's essentially everyone's I think everyone's well aligned to make this successful and account for the specificities of the open source communities. And the idea is, how can we facilitate, how can we make that possible, and how can we make sure that we're part of, that we're not accidentally forgotten or not mentioned, or our specificities aren't addressed.
Yeah, I like getting in on the front end of this as opposed, I think maybe the industry, open source industry came in too late to CRA and then really had to work hard to get in front of it. So I like getting in.
I mean, we're going to have to work hard.
I know
sure,
we're gonna have to work hard.
yes.
I like getting in front of it, but also I think I've seen, like we've even talked too, when it's not sometimes a cookie cutter approach with security and technology. So this group has already been working on what are some of those issues where we are a little different, that you can't put mandates on us. So I feel like we've done a lot of the work already.
I do too, yeah, for sure.
So it's just packaging it up and making sure that we have a seat at the table and we're engaged and informed. So. And again, this, you all are the decision makers. I mean, this is how our collaboration spaces are set up. This is the group who is empowered to make a decision whether or not we participate. It's just not Robin, and it's, not the board, but this is how we've sort of worked on some of these decisions.
And I do also want to mention that I'm wearing a bunch of different caps here, and so I would entirely recuse myself from any kind of decision. Here, of course, I support it. I wouldn't have taken that client on, that as client work otherwise. And I think this is really important. And I think that, yes, the open source community came late to the party, but through the work of lots of different people, lots of different organizations, tireless, and we ended up in a place where the CRA could have been incredibly damaging or incredibly problematic, and ends up being like a, frankly, fairly reasonable piece of legislation when you think about the complexity of like actually putting something like that in law is, and was policymakers and standard setting organizations who are really willing and curious and good people to work with and well intended to make this successful. And so I think it's a really good opportunity, and that's my position. But again, like it's entirely not for me to make the call, in this context.
What do you all think? Ben, I'd like to hear your perspective.
I don't know. I am unclear on the level of effort,
Hmm.
and that's my main concern at this point.
So I can,
Other than Toby's comment saying we're going to have to work really, really, really hard.
as a community, I'm not saying specifically like you all have, going to have to do the heavy lifting. I'm just saying, um, compliance in general for the software industry, like becoming a regulated industry. When you have something as wild and different as open source as a core part of it, is not going to be simple, right? Like in general, like I don't think that's going to be easy. Um, but more specifically, like really there for me, if I look at what needs to happen, I think a commitment for the foundation to join would be useful as a signal, right? That is not a long thing to do. That's like an administrative thing, right? So that's not huge. Then I think that just sitting down with me and saying, here's where, like, I'm just going to show you the doc. I think that's going to be like way easier. I just have to find it. Hold on for a sec.
And while
Um,
he looks, I've been trying to engage more with government leaders as well in this space. I went to Korea for an OECD event, because not only are they implementing regulations, but if you find in any industry, when regulations come, then government funding comes along with that to support the industry. So I see it, helpful, and hopefully more sovereign tech funds will be born as a result. So.
I see
Ulysses, your hand
Ulysses.
raised.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, yeah. So from my side, I will say, like, I mean, as a European, and a person who does open source, I'm all in, just because it's going to affect me very close, right? So that's an easy buy. I'm thinking also that even if we are not pretty sure about how much effort it will require, I mean, it's going to be a hard job, definitely, but it's just, as Toby said, just a piece inside of this big regulation, right? So first of all, I don't think we need to know yet how much effort it will require, because we probably it's not going to happen at this moment, right? So we are not going to start working hard next week. Probably it's going to happen soon, right? And the creating a law, it's a long process, right? So probably it's going to be an engaging in a long term, and probably something that we can, just bring people in and take people out and so on. So we can, find who is the best people to be there. But I think the most important, I mean, if we don't have a lot of input there, because we don't have like all the resources to make that effort realistically, at least to having the option to be there in the table and knowing what's going on and trying to bring that attention to the people who are in the community, that can be a good option to bring new actors, opinion, and so on board. So that also can be our role, even if we are not, we don't have a lot of bandwidth to deal with a big effort in terms of commitment. Maybe we can just see what happened, provide inputs, and get involved, and see how far we can get. But just having, I mean, I think it's a nice opportunity. Not every time that there's a new regulation, try to involve all the parties. So this is a good time for us, and it's going to impact a lot of people who are actually working among many of the JavaScript project and open source in general. So I think it's a good option to be there.
Yeah, just a few things I think are worth addressing in both what like you and Robin said. On the funding aspect of this, I think that the European Commission is really aware of the importance of having a sustainable ecosystem. And they are very keen. And well, for example, I was at an OpenSSF event in Brussels in the spring, and Benjamin Burgels, who's the pen behind the CRA, really asked the audience, like, what can we do? What are out of the box ways of like helping support the ecosystem? So it's something that the Commission cares about and understands. So the huge plus one for that. There is discussions among some of the foundations as to whether or not the attestation system that the Commission is empowered to create. So essentially, if you look at, when you put a fridge on the European market, you'll have to have done due diligence that all of its components are actually like were built properly and secure, right? I mean, painting was hugely broad strokes here. And of course, if you look at the whole open source dependency tree, you immediately know that like, this is going to be a very hard task, right? And so there is the possibility for open source stewards, aka again was broad strokes open source foundations, to support that through an attestation system, and that still needs to be entirely defined. It is possible, and some actors are thinking about actually making those attestations something that people, like organizations putting products on the market, could purchase from foundations. So there are this. I'm not saying that this is an option or not. I actually don't like it. This is one of the topics that's being discussed in a work stream in the group, right? So there are discussions around, is this the opportunity to actually formalize some of those dependencies and maybe have a system that like makes the whole thing more sustainable, for example, like that, right? So clearly some of the things that are discussed and thought about. So absolutely, I think that's it's an important part of the topic, right? You cannot have a secure system if the system is not sustainable. I think people are getting a sense of that. And then the second point you brought up, Ulysses, which is like, this is going to take a long time. So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the law is, the law hasn't been officially published yet, though it's expected that it might be either next week or in like the month following, right? So very soon. And then there's an application period of the law. I think it's like roughly 2.5 years or 3 years. I can't remember the specifics, right? But during that time, a whole bunch of additional what are called implementing and delegated acts will be written. So there's like, you have the sort of high level legislation that's like fixed, and then you have like, okay, how do you implement it? And all of the standards need to be published by then, because when the law comes into force in 2027, I think. So yeah, 3 years after it's officially there, products will have to be on the market and comply on day one of that, right? And so if you think about that 3-year deadline and you work back from that in terms of how long do these official standard organization processes actually work, well, input is going to happen in the next couple of months, right? Like sort of between now and the spring mostly. Right. So it's a fairly aggressive and tight agenda. There's going to be more opportunity, for other things or guidelines. There's a bunch of like stuff around this legislation, including FAQs that the European Union will publish. There's a whole bunch of things, but it's going to happen fairly quickly. And once you're done with the CRA, there's like NIST 2, which is for the service aspects of like sort of like pure SaaS, which is also getting revamped. And then you have like the Open Source AI Act, which is also getting to work, which has like connections to it, and so there's going to be increasing like people are going to be busy for sure. And sooner, and rather sooner than later. So I just wanted to share with you exactly what, just like the thing that the inventory that we're working on right now. And wait, let me share it here. So what we're looking at here is the horizontal standards. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but they're essentially horizontal standards, which is that everyone has to implement, and the vertical for like special areas like operating systems or password managers, for example. And you have two types of horizontal standards, sort of like low level, and they're called type A, and then higher level, and they're called type B, and they're due a little later, but that's like the end product, right? The development of those is starting now. The two type A ones is designing, developing, and producing products with digital elements in such a way that they ensure an appropriate level of cybersecurity based on the risks. That is the title of the standard, and that's the old information that we're working with for now, right? And it's like the most vague thing in the world, right? And then you have the vulnerability handling. It has more information there. And then you have the type B standards, which are, more specific about specific things, right? Secure default configuration, right? So not shipping, a device was admin and 1234 as password, things like this, right? So you have, encryption, right, of stored data, et cetera. Like you have a bunch of different standards, right? And then you have cybersecurity policy, which is one of the specific requirements. And this is literally, as an organization, what is it that we expect? What is it that we require from projects that are part of the foundation? And then there is the voluntary security attestation programs, which we discussed, I mentioned right before, and which is essentially how can you help people putting products on the market to meet all of those requirements that they will have to meet, right? And so the exercise really consists on doing essentially what OpenStack just did here, right? Which is to say, well, for this, right, here's what we have, right? Here's who wrote it, here's how it's licensed, here's like the level of formality, here's when it was done, and here's specific comments about it, right? And so, for example, for vulnerability handling, they pointed to this document and said, well, this was adapted by a whole bunch of foundations after the fact, right? And if you look at this, this is their process, right? So as a first step, this is maybe a couple of hours, maybe not even, right? It's like essentially saying, what is it that we do? Where are those things and how do they fit in, each and every one of those? Are we doing anything for any of this, right? And do we have a policy? Where's that policy? And are we do we already provide attestations of some form that might be useful as a structured format, right? And then if you look at the vulnerability handling, if you dig into Annex 1, Part 2 of the CRA, which is described here, you'll see mentioned of things like as bombs, etc., right? So also how we're thinking about these aspects. And just that would be huge and could have huge impact, really.
Steve, thoughts? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I work in a regulated industry, so this is pretty normal day to day for me. I'm in the banking segment, Capital One, in the US. So excited to see something like this come in. This seems huge. That's all. When it comes down to it.
Huge in a
Just
what?
huge in an effort to get it semi-correct the first time around, and then huge to make sure it's right all around for the future.
Mhm. Are you hearing anything on the US government front that's similar?
Don't know anything. I just know that we have the things that Toby just shared. A lot of that is inherent in a lot of processes anyway for us in terms of regulation with our regulators on the financial side. So it will be nice to see it codified, I think, at a higher level versus just the banking segment.
Nice.
Yeah, and if you look at the U.S., NIST is creating standards that touch upon very similar topics. And the hope really is that if we get our house in order on the open source community and industry side, those standards are, the NIS, the NIST, and the European ones are essentially kind of saying, well, you do these things that you have described in these different standards that you as a community, as an industry and a community, build and own. And here are the high level requirements, so that we don't end up, again, in this place where, well, in the US, it's not exactly the same as in the EU. And now you need every project needs to have like 4 different documents that say slightly different but similar things in non-compatible ways, which would be just, it can entirely happen, which is going to be a huge waste of time and churn for everyone.
So I would love for each of you to drop a comment on whether or not thumbs up or what have you, and just briefly a couple of reasons why. That would be great. And then maybe Toby drop this issue in the security channel, so folks who didn't attend today's meeting can just flag it for them.
Sure, absolutely. I think it
Great.
might
And
be helpful.
We can put a link to the recording as well. Yes.
Exactly. I was going to say that because
Yeah.
there's very little context on the
Yes,
issue,
right.
and it's hard to give that context in written.
Exactly.
Frankly.
I would drop a link to that document as well that you just shared.
Absolutely, I can do that for sure.
Awesome.
Toby, I have one more follow-up question. It sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like the initial step, if we were to get involved, would to be go through all those CRA references you had mentioned and go through the language and just do a brief review to highlight any areas that were like, this is fine, we don't see a concern, here's an area where we have potential concerns, and doesn't have to go into like an extraordinary amount of analytical detail, but to give a high level initial assessment.
I think it's even lighter than this at this point. I think the very first ask would be, if we look there's in that document that I shared it's actually fairly simple, right? There were 2 high-level horizontal standards, and I think 12 or 13 more specific ones. And the specific ones, we probably as an organization won't have much, right? Because we don't have standards for how we need to do encryption on projects, right? Some projects might have opinions about some of those. Yes, Robin, it is a mapping exercise, absolutely, right? But essentially, I really think that the first exercise would be to say, if we look at key things that are relevant, what is it that we do and where is that documentation? And I think that as a first step is huge, because if not, essentially it's just not there, right? If it's there, it has to be accounted for. And so that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I wouldn't go through how and why we decided to take this position, right? Exactly. I would just put the link to where the decision is that we made as OpenJS.
At this point, absolutely, right? It might entirely be, at some point in the future that there is contention around a subtopic of something, and then actually being able to argue this and make the case for why this works or doesn't work for the community is useful, right? Why is always useful, but it's only figure out the why for when we need it. And so yeah, so right now just mapping would be perfectly enough. Yeah, and I can help walk you through it, because I've now spent more time than I would ever imagine I would have spent on a legal document in my life on this thing, and I'm still figuring my way around it. It's fairly beefy. There's a lot going on, but yeah, overall, the key requirements are spelled out in the document that I shared. Yeah, if you have a good sense of those, that's a really good first step. All right. Well, thank you so much all for your time and questions. And yeah, I find that weirdly exciting.
Robin, you want our comments in the task?
In the issue.
Oh yeah, in the issue, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Alrighty, well, thanks, Toby. That was really interesting and fascinating, and looking forward to seeing how this goes, regardless of how the foundation's involved. So, in the time we have left, I'm gonna jump to the next um, item, which is regarding. Oh, I just accidentally found the keyboard shortcut to disable my video. Which is regarding the SBOM and security provenance um, um, observations and recommendations. So this document, as of now, is pretty much content complete. There's some tweaks to additions to make around contextual analysis of the threat environment to put into the preamble and to write the executive summary. But before I wrote the executive summary at the top, I wanted to have everyone give some feedback. Here is a link to the document itself. Steve, in particular, I really appreciated your inputs on terminology and precision on phrasing on stuff. You'll see, hopefully, all of your suggestions reflected in the document now. That resulted in a lot of changes, but I think they were really good suggestions. So, and I think Mateo and Ulysses' perspectives were also quite valuable in refining the message on how the information is delivered for reading comprehension. So a lot of changes related to that. Since the last time you all viewed it, I've also totally fleshed out the attestation and provenance section. The one of the things to focus on, a couple of things to focus on there is that the set of recommendations regarding provenance and attestation for packages, the conclusions are pretty much a feature list for GitHub and NPM. So, which I think is what we expected. But when I went through it, it is a non-trivial amount of engineering work to ask of them. So I would appreciate your all's views on these asks and whether or not they should be softened or if they should be written in a more precise way. I just want to make sure that we're all comfortable with basically throwing it seems like there's really only one to two engineers at going through all the issues and all the commits and everything. It looks like there's about 1.5 to 1.75 engineers working on this topic at GitHub. So it's probably if this was resourced, if these changes were resourced that way, we're talking about easily a year of engineering, potentially more, to do all of these things. So yeah, I would just be aware of that when you look at it. So that's my top concern. The other thing to look at as well is the SBOM related recommendations. These turned out to be actually, when I went through it, I really thought hard on what SBOM recommendations should look like. And I broke that up into two different sections. One about JavaScript libraries and one about JavaScript applications. And the recommendations turned out to be pretty simple actually, because and less complex than I was expecting them to be. Because in the end, the um, there really isn't much to, it's the gap that I discovered is that really, and what I chose to not do is to tell NPM to completely change the way that they do dependency resolution. I thought that was like a bridge too far, maybe. So if we're not going to go saying NPM should like change the way it does dependency resolution to provide a more concrete experience, then the recommendations are kind of binary. Like JavaScript libraries should do this, and JavaScript applications should do that. So let me know what you all think. There's absolutely room to improve. So yeah, thanks for the feedback in advance. Oh, Toby, your hand's up.
I just wanted to share something that I find interesting. I don't know what the background is on this document, but the CRA has requirements around SBOMs. So I put the link to the exact space where they discussed this and the specific line. And what's really interesting is from a conformance and compliance requirement at this point, they're not looking at transitive dependencies just at the first layer,
Oh,
which is,
fascinating.
yeah, right. Because on one hand, you're like, this doesn't actually solve really the underlying security problem at all, right? But on the other hand, as a project or as a foundation, etc., if you can meet compliance requirements in a way that's easy as a first step and do better from a security perspective in a way that makes sense, that's also worth being aware of, right? So it's a funny point where knowing exactly what's required, being like around the table, helps maybe figure out like internal policies or security policies that are both compliant and better,
Thanks, Toby.
if that makes
Oh,
sense.
yeah, totally. That's fascinating, though, that they're only doing direct dependencies instead of transitive. Kind of the whole point of SBOMs really is the transitive dependencies. Um, Fascinating. Ben.
Thanks. Yeah. Two quick things on this one. I think we should try and time box this this revision cycle in the SBOM doc. We go over a lot, and I do think we should try and push on publishing it. The second thing is that, and I put this feedback in the doc originally, but I still feel that this small section of clear recommendations for the projects is what's missing. And I think that's really necessary because the document is really good on background and contains a lot of information that I think a certain set of people are going to be really interested in. But practically speaking, we also need, here are the 4 things that OpenJS requires of its projects. So we can add that to our checklist stuff. And at least reading the document now, it's hard for me to get that information out. So I just really want to call that out somewhere, saying like, if you aren't interested in the whole background of SBOMs and our recommendations for the greater ecosystem, here's what you need to do as an OpenJS project.
Yeah, I think Ben, what you're looking for is, I think you made the original suggestion for an executive summary, and so I think the highlights of what you're talking about there,
Yeah,
should absolutely go there, and hopefully that'll give like that initial top level 1-pager summary for folks. I just didn't want to write that yet until people were comfortable with the actual
yeah,
recommendations themselves.
understood. Like I think in addition to, so maybe not a 1-pager, but like some bullets, right? So what I'm really trying to do is like make it as easy as possible for some of the projects that are going to be going, like a new project that comes in, right? And they're like, what is my checklist of things that I need to do to graduate as an OpenJS project? And we can say, in addition to all these other things that you need to do, like here's the 3 things from the SBOM document that we can pull in. So that's, I just want to be really crisp on like the use case I'm thinking of and what I'm expecting in the final phase of of the doc.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Ben.
Yep.
I'll definitely keep that in mind. And one of the things I'll also do is I'll take another look at, definitely go look at the recommendation sections. And if you have any specific feedback, check that out. But I will also take another swag at it to make sure it's like super clear and that it's easy to summarize into the summary at the top. Toby?
Yeah, to Ben's point, like if we end up with something like the IP policy guidance that we had for security would be great. Something like that. Something that helps, project just like know what they have to do real quick and not have to dig into the specifics. So I'm assuming we'll end up with a document of that nature. And so, something that makes authoring this easy. Oh, that's great.
The security compliance guidelines are meant to provide that. They're kind of on the long side, but I've tried to design the GitHub data to make it straightforward to consume. But unfortunately, it is kind of lengthy, to be honest.
Yeah.
Definitely check them out.
Yeah, I think what would help too is once you get those executive summaries in action, like we sit down with Jen in marketing and Ben, and let's just build out that website. I think that will help even make it a little more crystal clear, just for folks who just need, we're going to have a security page on our OpenJS website. Again, most people don't read beyond a quick paragraph. I have a journalism background, so that's what we need. We really need a paragraph. And then
Okay, we'll do.
linking out a couple of bullet points. And by a paragraph, I mean like 3 typed lines, in a couple.
Understood. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, no problem. Cool. We are nearly at time, so I really appreciate you all looking at this. Like Ben mentioned, if we could time box this for y'all to take a look in the next 24, 48 hours, I would really appreciate that so that we can hopefully publish by the end of the week. I am fairly confident that we can achieve that, given that from an original ideas perspective, Jordan and Matteo and Steve and Ulysses have given some pretty specific insight and feedback. So this revision is mostly like and the review is to make sure that that information is effectively captured correctly and easily understood. But from a data perspective, I think I'm fairly confident we're in a good place. So I don't think this review should take too long and we can get it out the door. All right. Thank you so much, folks. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback on that.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.